Welcome to episode 4 of Rooted Resilience, where we explore narratives of current and contemporary Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ creatives living on colonized Nipmuc, Nonotuck, and Pecumtuck land, also known as Western Massachusetts. I'm Em.
And I'm Luke. And every second Tuesday of the month, we gather here to listen to these multi-talented culture creators with curiosity, intention, and a little bit of magic. This is our first season of the podcast, and we are so grateful to everyone who has listened, shared, and been part of our journey so far. But we need your support to continue sharing these voices and stories. Visit givebutter.com/rooted-resilience to visit our fundraising page and get involved. Here's our show.
Whenever I am just surrounded by Arabs or Palestinians, it just feels like an extension of my family. And I can breathe a little easier. And I don't have to explain things to people. And I don't have to be careful about my words because things will be misinterpreted. I can just be and exist. And it's really beautiful. And so that's been incredibly rejuvenating for me to be able to find that community locally.
In this episode, you will hear from Western Massachusetts-born Hannah Moushabeck, author, editor, and marketer, and in the eyes of many, an activist. Hannah's first picture book, Homeland, My Father Dreams of Palestine, was published in April of 2023 and was the first picture book written by a Palestinian and featuring Palestine in over 30 years. Currently, she works within her family's business, Interlink Publishing, as a partial owner, where she is also seeking to redefine how small publishing companies engage with communities. She is also working to continue to expand the legacy her parents have passed on to her and her siblings, in uplifting and centering works of literature and translation, history, activism, politics, art, cultural guides, award-winning cookbooks, and illustrated children's books from around the world.
Please be advised, this episode contains sensitive content.
My name is Hannah Moushabeck. I'm an author and an editor and a marketer. And I don't love saying activist, though people keep putting that label on me. So I think I probably should just accept it. I'm a jack of all trades when it comes to things bookish. In April 2023, I published my debut picture book, Homeland, My Father Dreams of Palestine. It was the first picture book to come out written by a Palestinian featuring Palestine in over 30 years. So there was a lot of pressure on that release. I did lots of events. I went all over the country. I spoke to families and children. I went to conferences. It was an incredible year. 3 days after I won the New England Book Award, it was October 7th. And suddenly my book was considered incredibly relevant and timely, though I would argue it was always relevant and timely. Fast forward a few months, I had been working at my corporate publishing job. I've been in publishing for over 10 years. And I decided to quit my job and to join my family's press that has been around for 38 years as of this year. They have always been trying to get me to join, and I was the last holdout of all my siblings. And something about the state of the world and how unbearable it felt to work on anything other than amplifying Palestinian voices in 2023, I decided to take the plunge and I quit my job and I joined my family's publishing house. And a few months later, our parents transferred ownership to their 3 daughters and brother-in-law. So I'm now one of 4 owners of Interlink Publishing. No pressure. So when my parents started the publishing company, it was in 1987. I actually just found out that they started it 13 days after I was born, as if they had nothing else to do. So they started this small radical press in Brooklyn, and they were deeply immersed in the Arab community and were really appalled by the lack of access that anyone had to our world-shiftingly significant literature that, I mean, we, not to brag, but like we invented literature, like we invented math, we invented public libraries, we invented universities and education. Like the Arabs had a lot. And you would look things up, you would look up these writers like Khalil Gibran or like Mahmoud Darwish, and you wouldn't be able to find them translated into English. All you ever got exposed to were like, these racy like CIA agent thrillers like in Afghanistan and whatnot, or Indiana Jones movies, So they were so appalled by the lack of representation, and they started the company so that they could start to bring that literature. And eventually it expanded to food and to art and to children's books from around the global South. But we were also a tiny little radical press, and it was incredibly scrappy. So it meant that if we ever brought over an author, they were staying in my room and I was sleeping on the floor in my sister's room, And we had some of the most incredible like poets and activists and like writers, people who are in the history books in the Middle East come through like our apartment in Brooklyn. And to me, they were just like, oh, that's like Ammo Mahmoud or whatever. Like they were not significant. I did not know who they were. But it was really incredible to grow up surrounded by that. And, some of the writers that we are still publishing today have like changed my diapers as a baby and have like come and stayed with our family. So we do business a little bit differently. It really is like a family in that sense. And that was always really incredible. I think, being introduced to the concept that a book can change the world makes it hard to want to do anything else, and there was always that pursuit of liberation. I think every Palestinian in the diaspora feels this responsibility to use any power or privilege that they have to educate people about Palestinians, to shine a light on the injustice that's been happening for my entire lifetime, for my father's entire lifetime. And I think that starting this publishing company was absolutely a part of that. And we knew as children that no matter what we would do, if we were like doctors or engineers or, publishers, that we also needed to contribute to that goal of liberation. And I like to think that they really pioneered Arabic literature in the US. We have a lot more now, thank God. Like we've seen like a real incredible explosion. We now have a lot of Palestinian writers being published. Musab Abu Towa is on the New York Times bestseller list this week with his poetry collection, Forest of Noise. And I like to think that my parents played a part in opening the eyes of Americans to Palestinian literature.
As Hannah continues, she shares with us what it has been like to live into the fullness of her identity, personally and professionally.
So at the moment, I'm working on a lot of different projects. I work on publishing projects with my day job at a publishing company. I work on children's books as an author, which I have already sold another one, and I have another one in the works at the moment. And I also am really involved in community organizing, particularly when it comes to the Palestinian liberation movement. So I am certainly busy. It might be a bit of an understatement. But all of these things work really in tandem. And that's really the first time that's happened to me in my life. I've always had to compartmentalize parts of myself, depending on what job I had or what community I was in. Working in the publishing landscape, the corporate publishing landscape, I really had to separate the parts of me that were Palestinian, that were radical, that were leftist, and keep my head down. Otherwise, I wouldn't keep a job for very long. And, this was something that became really increasingly difficult as I became more vocal as an activist, as I was, seen on the front of newspapers, or videos of me giving speeches at rallies would go viral, and my boss would ask, why suddenly I had, an extra 30,000 followers on my Instagram. It became harder and harder to hide who I was, as I felt it was my responsibility to use any power or privilege that I had in this world to advocate for my people in the face of what is arguably the most devastating thing to ever happen in our history. It was watching the trauma that has been handed down to me through generations happen again in front of my very eyes. And it became impossible to look at anything else. So in a way, it was a real fusing or a coming out for me, especially because I've always been involved in these liberation movements, whether it's fat liberation or queer liberation, but I had never tied all of these pieces of myself together. And suddenly it felt unbearable to have any community that wasn't acknowledging the suffering of my people. So I really put it out there. I challenged fat liberationists to see the connections to the atrocities that were happening in Gaza, how, fat stigma is based in, white supremacy and celebrating European beauty standards, and how that is, goes hand in hand with colonization. And, I talked about queer liberation and how, pinkwashing was used as a tool in Israel in order to justify their genocide against Palestinians and convince the world that they were more humanitarian than they were. And so by tying all these pieces of myself together, I was able to really kind of come out of my shell. I didn't have to cut myself up into pieces to belong in certain spaces. And it was hard. I lost a lot of friends along the way. I lost friends and coworkers and no longer felt safe in certain spaces. And that was really devastating. But I gained so many other, allies that, I now feel like are, chosen family. And that's been really incredible.
We have a couple of events coming up.
First, we're hosting a Rooted Resilience potluck and open mic to celebrate the summer solstice on Friday, June 27th at Two Mamas Farm in Cummington, Massachusetts from 6 to 9 p.m. Bring offerings of poetry, music, food, performances, you name it, speaking to the theme of rising and resilience.
We hope you join us for the next Rooted Resilience Community Dialogue Circle on Thursday, July 23rd at 6:30 p.m. This virtual gathering is an opportunity to explore the themes of rooted resilience with others. In July, we'll bring in themes from this conversation with author Hannah Moushabeck.
For more information on both of these happenings, visit rootedresilience.substack.com/events. We'll hear Hannah reflect on what being the partial owner of her family's business means to her, including how she is carrying the legacy forward in relationship to community and why.
I have so many hopes for the future. I think it's a huge responsibility to be sort of handed the reins of your parents' life's work. We are all deeply committed to carrying on their legacy of publishing marginalized voices, of translating incredible fiction from Arabic from the Middle East. We're the number one publisher of Arabic literature and translation. We're the number one publisher of books about or by Palestinians in the country. We're the only Palestinian-owned publishing company in the U.S. So we really want to carry on the work that we're doing. But of course, we're an entirely different generation. So to me, that also means getting involved with my community, throwing events that are in line with our mission and our beliefs. Last year we threw this together in maybe like 3 weeks. It was really incredible. And I will not do it in that timeline again, but we held the Read and Resist Fest in our parking lot. And it was such an incredible collaborative event even from the get-go, where our parking lot was completely overgrown by sumac trees and we could barely park a car there. And we just put out an email to some friends, some customers, some collaborators, and all of a sudden we had 30 people show up with landscaping equipment, helping us cut down trees and, scatter mulch and make the space completely ready with just, within a few hours. We then, organized this festival where we really wanted an opportunity for people to mingle and engage with all of these different social justice groups that we've been connected with in the last year. Everything from, Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, but even, the Asylum Seekers Network and Translate Gender and the Mask Block in Western Mass. We wanted to bring all of these people together and do teach-ins and workshops throughout the day. And we sat there expecting maybe 20 people to come. And all of a sudden, just hundreds and hundreds of people started showing up. It got to the point where we had to designate volunteers to do like traffic control in the neighborhood because so many people were trying to come to our parking lot in Northampton to engage in this festival. And it really proved the point to me that while traditionally we've published books and the impact that we have is around the world, we are a business to business. We sell books to bookstores sell books to readers. And we haven't really engaged as directly with our community. I think a lot of people will drive past our warehouse and think that it's like abandoned maybe. But with our generation, we are so determined to engage in the community. So, people know who to call. People know that when they buy one of our books, that they're not just supporting our family, that they're supporting our community work as well. And we want to expand that. We were able to bring Rashida Tlaib for a conversation at UMass last year. We have so many plans to bring other incredible speakers to the community. And we've raised, tens of thousands of dollars for aid in Gaza through t-shirt campaigns, sticker campaigns. We're about to do our second tattoo flash pop-up where we raised $5,000 in 24 hours, all volunteer-based tattoo artists coming in. We had about 50 people get tattooed in our office, in our like very bookish offices. So for me, the future, I think, is leaning into that a lot more. I think what's incredible about the way the book industry has gone now is you have the ability to connect directly with your readers. When in the past, you would sell to libraries, to bookstores, but you were never really necessarily meeting your readers directly. And this has been a real difficulty for us as a Palestinian publisher because there are so many roadblocks when we want to publish books by Palestinians or about Palestine. And so many of the gatekeepers won't review our books or won't publicize our books, not just because we're a small indie, but also because we're amplifying voices that are considered controversial to them. So that has always been a real challenge for us. But with the dawn of social media and the internet, we can now reach people directly, and they are supporting us in the most incredible way. So it's a really exciting time. It's a really scary time because the margins on books are incredibly thin, and now the entire family's well-being depends on this very unreliable industry. So that's a little terrifying, but for the most part, I think the future is very hopeful.
Finally, we've arrived at the conversation of Hannah's first picture book, Homeland, My Father Dreams of Palestine. The intersection of identity, Hannah's work as a publisher and marketer, and her own creative process all come into play, along with the friend we all know, imposter syndrome.
So I always write my picture books in a fit of rage, which is interesting because they're for children and my book has a fart in it. But, this one was written when I was just incredibly frustrated because I had been part of a really big movement in children's book publishing to demand more diverse books. An organization called We Need Diverse Books had just launched, and, a lot of the younger generation was pushing editors to start acquiring books that represented more of the world around us, because publishing had historically been just incredibly, incredibly white and cis and straight. And I got to work on some of the most incredible diverse books in my career. I got to work on Christian Robinson's first ever picture book, and he's gone on to win the Caldecott Award many times. He had a campaign with Target. Like, he's a rock star. I got to work on some of Jason Reynolds' books, who was the children's book ambassador in the United States 2 sessions in a row. But all the while, I was waiting and waiting for more books about Arabs or, possibly Palestinians to be published, so that I could see my own reality reflected. And it never happened. In the 10 years that I was working in publishing, I didn't work on a single book by an Arab American, nonetheless a Palestinian. And things were happening. I think Gaza was being bombed again. This was in 2016, and I was just so frustrated that I decided I was going to write a proposal for a book and then find a quote unquote real writer to write it. And the proposal for the story was about my family. And I remember I was like, I'm just going to write it in my own words, but like, obviously the real writer can come in and write it properly. And I sent it to a friend of mine who was an editor, and I was like, this is the proposal that I've written, and here's some real writers that have never written for children, but I think that they could do it. And she was like, Hannah, what are you doing? You've written a picture book. Why? Why are you trying to get someone else to write your family's story? And she was like, this may be awkward, and you may not have meant this for when you sent it to me, but actually I want to acquire this book. So I feel almost bad telling that story, because the amount of writers who, spend years and years submitting to editors, and I wasn't even trying to sell a book and got a deal out of it. But there was a lot of imposter syndrome that I was dealing with. And I also felt a huge amount of pressure. A Palestinian picture book hadn't come out in 30 years, and I did not want to be the only one representing my people. For starters, I'm mixed. My mother's English and my father's Palestinian. I'm a Christian Palestinian, which is only 14% of Palestinians. So there were a lot of ways in which I didn't represent a lot of Palestinians. So I decided, as soon as my book was acquired, that I could not be the last Palestinian to sell a children's book. So I put a call out online, and I said, if you're a Palestinian interested in writing for children, please get in contact with me. And I started this group called Palestinians in Kidlit, where anyone who was interested, whether they were just dreaming of it or if they were fully on their way to having a manuscript ready, I would give them any advice, connections I had. I would bring in experts to the group. We met every single month, and I would do all that I could to get more Palestinians published. And I'm happy to say it's been 4 years since that group started, and I'm happy to say that there's about 11 new Palestinian books that are being published by major publishing houses. And there is now a subgenre of Palestinian children's books, which, previously there really wasn't. So, in releasing my book, it was certainly lonely when it came out, because I was the only one.
This podcast is part of the Rooted Resilience Project, made possible through the generosity of these supporters and sponsors. Lemon Bakery, a queer and trans-owned bakery in Amherst, Massachusetts, run by Rory Hansen, providing homemade, locally sourced, seasonal baked goods with curbside pickup and delivery service.
Bombeck Center for Arts and Equity, a world-class performing arts space in Florence, Mass. Home to music, film, theater, dance, and memorable community gatherings. Visit bombecks.live to learn more. and Mass Humanities and the Mass Cultural Council, championing the arts and humanities here in the Commonwealth. To learn more about becoming a sponsor, visit rootedresilience.substack.com/sponsors. Now back to our show. Hannah's journey with the publication of her first picture book has included large amounts of unexpected criticism and controversy. We hear more from her as she shares the different ways this has unfolded in the process of sharing this book.
And I also, from day one was met with a lot of criticism and controversy. In fact, there wasn't a ton of media coverage for my book, but there was an article in a Canadian newspaper where they said 5 books to check out this summer, and they recommended my book. And this was not like a major feature by any means. That's pretty low bar in terms of publicity. And a Zionist Canadian group called for him to be fired because of including my book in this article. They literally started a petition to have this journalist fired. So I knew from that moment that it was never going to be an easy road for me. And that despite my decade of experience in marketing, that I was going to have a different experience than most of my authors. And I've represented, queer authors and Black authors who certainly have gotten their fair share of harassment and criticism. But this was an entirely new level that I don't know that I was completely prepared for. I have always gone into this as, someone with curiosity, someone being open and saying, I'm happy to have any conversation. I wrote a story about my family, and that's it. This is not a book that is political. This is not a book that is meant to be controversial. This is a book about my lived experience and cannot be denied. And yet so many articles have been written accusing me of having an agenda, accusing me of indoctrinating children to become terrorists. I mean, this is legitimately a quote from an article. They cite me saying that I am a known Hamas supporter and anti-Semite for writing a picture book about my family. And I have to remind you, it has a fart in it. It has been a wild journey. And I think I expected, to some extent, I've been Palestinian all my life. I've recognized that my identity has been hotly debated by many. I recognize that there are very well-funded powers at play. But what I didn't expect was some of the institutions that I loved and respected and had stood up for so many of my friends who had other identities would turn their backs on me in the course of the last few years. Organizations like PEN America, which is supposed to be the #1 organization to prevent banning and censorship, refused to make a statement about the hundreds of writers in Palestine who had been killed, or about my own book, which had been banned all over the country. There was one instance that was featured in a New York Post article where a Zionist couple went into every branch of the New York Public Library to check out copies of my book in order to prevent children from having access to them. I mean, it was wild, and PEN America would not consider this an official ban. So, it was jarring. There were so many of these places that I really loved, even locally. I was supposed to do an event last year, a school that advertises itself as a social justice-based school. And the week before I was supposed to do my talk, they had another author who was an outspoken advocate for Palestine, but was not in fact Palestinian herself. And they called me the day before I was supposed to do an event, and they canceled the event, citing that I was anti-Semitic. And the irony of that was that I had actually been invited because 2 of my best friends have a child in this school, and they also happen to be Jewish. So they decided to listen to some voices and not others about me. And it was deeply upsetting to have an organization in our own community repeat these racist tropes about me and say that I was a danger to children. And that was really upsetting and continues to be really upsetting. I expect it from certain publications. The New York Post, I'm certainly not reading on a daily basis. But when it is people that you respect and that you love and that you assume have the same core values as you, but fall for this misinformation and propaganda, that's when it really hurt. Yeah, I mean, this experience has certainly changed me in every way. I'm incredibly strong-headed and stubborn, so I actually tend to double down and do more after I'm told I can't. So, for example, in my first book, I was very light-handed when it came to talking about Palestine, because I knew that it had been so long since a book had been published about Palestine. And so I didn't use words like Nakba or Intifada that I knew would be considered controversial. I really thought that, like, because I kept it so personal, that would protect me from a lot of the criticism, which is kind of hilarious in retrospect. So for my second book, which should be coming out in 2026, I did not hold back in any way. I wrote a book that will be so controversial, that uses phrases like from the river to the sea and words like martyr. I realized that it doesn't matter what I say, it's who I am, it's what I am that is offensive to so many people. And so I might as well just speak my truth. I might as well be completely unapologetic in my existence, because I will be criticized either way. So that's been a really valuable lesson.
We learn that the conflict and criticism that Hannah has and continues to receive is not without impact on her life and her creativity, and yet she persists.
In the last 2 years, I've been thinking so much more about intergenerational trauma. My grandparents were survivors of the Nakba in 1948, which is the day that Palestinians called a catastrophe. It was a day when 1 million Palestinians were forced to leave their homes, my grandparents included. And it was incredibly violent, and they saw a lot of their loved ones, killed and left on the side of the road as they fled. And I've heard stories about this my entire life, and always didn't totally believe in intergenerational trauma. But with the actions that have happened over the last 2 years and watching the exact same thing happen, it's been such a visceral experience. Not only have I felt it emotionally, but I have felt it physically. It has had an effect on my physical health, which I did not expect. I got sick more. I had such low energy. I developed long COVID. There have been a few experiences where in my rational brain, I knew that I wasn't in danger, but I could not convince my body that I wasn't. For example, we had held a vigil on October 7th. It was a multi-faith vigil. It was Jews and Muslims and Christians and people of all faiths. And we came together and lit candles, and we had this beautiful flower passing ceremony. And this local Zionist man who has been harassing my family showed up in person and was shouting, that we were murderers, that we were rapists, and shoving his phone in our faces. And he particularly wanted to film me, and he particularly wanted to film my family. And he kept saying, "The Moushabecks have indoctrinated you," which is really giving us so much more credit than we are due. And when he got close to me, I noticed that he was wearing his IDF dog tags and knowing just how many of my people the IDF have killed just in the last 2 years, I had this like guttural reaction where I immediately looked for my sister's children, and I felt like I had to put my body physically between him and them. And I like still have nightmares about this guy who lives down the road, whose kids go to school with my sister's kids, who has sent threats to my family on the internet, in person. And I know logically, like, we're fine. Like, he's not going to show up. But there was something so physical that I didn't expect. And I'm continuing to have nightmares about it, where suddenly that reality that this man has served in a military, has likely killed Palestinians, was so much scarier than everything that I was seeing on my phone screen. And suddenly it felt like the genocide had come home, had come to our town and come for my family. I actually went to a writing retreat like a few days afterwards and was pretty unable to do anything. I just was processing what had happened and was watching the news obsessively. It's been really hard to be creative. And I'm okay actually pausing on my own personal creativity. The beautiful thing about working in publishing is that I get to actually uplift the voices of so many people that don't have creative blocks. I get to be a cheerleader and help their work find new readers. And I love that. I'm actually happy to take a break from the limelight. I'm happy to take a creative break, particularly when you're writing for children, because you have to protect them. And when children are hearing about Palestine or Palestinians or even Arabs or Muslims, they're hearing about violence being done to them, or they're hearing about them being violent. They're not hearing about our joy. They're not hearing about our culture, our food, or our music, or our dancing. And so for me, it's really important that when I do write, that I am embodying those things. I'm giving children who maybe have never come into contact with a Palestinian person an experience that they're going to enjoy. You know, so many times children will read my book and they'll say, my favorite part is the fart. And I think that's really telling. You know, ultimately my book does have sadness in it, but it also has a lot of joy. And I think that's kind of the perfect embodiment of what it is to be a human. And unfortunately, the world does not see Palestinians as human right now.
The hardest question to ask is the one we asked next. We wanted to give space to the harsh truth of what she and others are experiencing. And yet we have also seen Hannah bring an incredible amount of love and joy to the people she interacts with. We asked Hannah what it is that is bringing her joy and nurturing her through these times, as she sees the destruction and genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza, and as she navigates being Palestinian American here in Western Massachusetts.
You know, I think whenever I see something particularly devastating on the news or on my phone, I like to joke that I need a dopamine fix. So I go to my sister's houses and I sniff their babies. They're not babies anymore. They're like 4, 5, 6 years old. You know, I think it's being around other humans that feel what I feel has been really powerful. And I grew up in the Pioneer Valley as one of the only Arab families. You know, we would often adopt different Arabs, like when they came, they were visiting professors, or they were like students who were without their parents for the first time from the Middle East, and we would adopt them. But in the past 2 years, through activism and community building, we've actually discovered so many more Arab families. And my aunt created this group called Habibis in the Valley. And we've been meeting up like once every few months and having a potluck. And I don't know if you've ever like been to an Arab's house, but like a potluck. First of all, this is not a concept in the Middle East. Like we all feed each other. But what's amazing about it is that everyone tries to one up each other. So they all bring like a massive main dish that's like probably taken 3 days to make. And it's maybe the best food that you've ever had in your life. And of course, like it's never just like food. There's always like children running around. And then there's like dancing that's happening and singing that's happening. And then suddenly everyone's like doing dubka around the room. And that has been so nourishing. Even just like getting to know that there are people locally that we never knew before. We felt completely isolated and on our own. And that group continues to grow. It's amazing. My aunt, she has like a gaydar for Arabs. She can like sniff them out with a 10-mile radius because suddenly, every few days, like 5 more people are added to the group chat that she's like bumped into at the supermarket. And growing up as a mixed person, but also in like a largely white area, I never had that experience of just being around my own people unless it was just my family. And so what it means is that whenever I am just surrounded by Arabs or Palestinians, it just feels like an extension of my family. And I can breathe a little easier. And I don't have to explain things to people, and I don't have to like be careful about my words because things will be misinterpreted. I can just be and exist, and it's really beautiful. And so that's been incredibly rejuvenating for me to be able to find that community like locally. Also, I should totally shout out Jack has been incredible through the whole process, holding me as I cry all the time, going to bat for me at various institutions and defending me. It's been really lovely.
Lastly, we ask Hannah what she wants to offer aspiring creatives and what rooted resilience means to her.
I get asked this all the time. And I think it's really, there's like strategic things that you can do, like practice your craft and like get mentors and all that. But I think the number one thing that I see is that people who want to be writers are not reading. I think it's so important that you're reading in the genre and the category that you want to publish in. So people will say, oh, I'm going to write a children's picture book. And I ask them, have you read any picture books? What was the last picture book you read? Like, how many have you read? How many have you read this year? Like, are you talking to booksellers? Are you talking to librarians? Do you know what other books in your genre and category and theme are being published? And a lot of the time they won't. And I think that that's the most valuable thing, is to really be able to immerse yourself in what is being published right now, because there's so many unnecessary books out there. I think there are people who want to publish a book about their dog because they love their dog. And there are people who have a good idea and think that they're the right person to publish it because they've had the idea, which is like a very, colonizer way of thinking of things. I like to really ponder, particularly when it comes to representation. Why is it that you're writing this story? How are you going to bring your own lived experiences to this story? And we see it all the time where people try to publish into what they see as a trend, and it falls flat because they don't have that experience. So I guess I would say read lots, and also ask yourself why you're writing this particular book and why it's important that it's you. When I think of rooted resilience, I think of the strength of my ancestors and pulling from that strength to keep me going. There's this force that I don't necessarily see or I can't necessarily feel. But when all else fails, I feel like I can pull from. There's one thing that gives me comfort, and it is that I know beyond a doubt that there will be a time when people look back at what's happening in our country and across the world, and they will say, who were the ones who stood up and who were the ones who said no, despite the repercussions for that. And I feel so confident that everyone I know and love will have sacrificed for others, even if it doesn't feel like that's within reach at the moment. Inshallah. My friend published a book called Inshallah So, which was just like, a book about a parent. The little girl keeps asking for things, and they're like, Inshallah. And like, I know, being like, we hope so, but probably not.
Thank you for listening to the Rooted Resilience podcast. If something resonated with you, we'd love to hear about it. You can email the show hosts at rootedresiliencepod@gmail.com or leave us a review on your favorite podcast streaming platform.
Dig deeper into our guests' work on our blog, where you can view all of our episodes and extended show notes and bonus content curated by our creatives. You can also find information about all of our upcoming virtual and in-person events, and subscribe for weekly updates at rootedresilience.substack.com. If you liked what you heard, please share this episode, rate it, and leave us a review. It helps so much, and we appreciate it deeply. Until next time, root deeply and keep rising in resilience.
We are deeply grateful to all of the community donors who have contributed to support this project. Rooted Resilience is a grant and community-funded project, and we still have a way to go in meeting our goal to fund our first season. So if you're passionate about supporting queer creative futures through the preservation of our histories, please visit givebutter.com/rooted-resilience to make a donation today. All dollar amounts are vital and greatly appreciated.
Thank you for centering Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ creatives with us. This work is more meaningful than ever as we face even steeper challenges in preserving our history for future generations.